Did you know that the forgotten founder of Zionism went on to play a leading role in Agudas Yisrael, or that Rav Chatzkel Abramsky was responsible for the continued presence of the Muslim Waqf on Har HaBayis? It turns out that the margins of history tell the real story. Behind the Times dives into the big concepts and overlooked moments that carry vast meaning, all through the lens of Torah and rabbinic thought. This is Jewish history like you've never heard it before. Behind the Times, with Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Galinsky and Gedalia Guttentag. Israel says it deeply regrets a strike on Gaza's only Catholic church, pledges investigation. That, Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Galinsky, is a headline from last week from CNN. Israel's busy there, still fighting after 2 years in Gaza. And apparently, nobody knew, but Gaza had a Catholic church. Israel bombed it. Why is this the beginning of a podcast in this series over here? And the answer is because it turns out that it may very possibly have been that Catholic church in Gaza may once have been Gaza's shul, the shul in Gaza City.
So you are hinting now that there was a Jewish presence in Gaza going back at least 200 years?
Correct. We know that there was a Catholic church. We know that there was built on the ruins of a historic shul. And this is an entryway into this podcast, which is going to be dealing with 20 years after the tragic destruction of the beautiful Jewish communities there in Gush Katif. We decided to do a historic episode from some recent history that's also current, as Israel spends years fighting inside this little strip of land over there. So we know that in 1831, the Gaza Jewish community, which had existed in one form or another, and we're going to go see how far back that goes, it definitely in modern times, let's call it from the 16th century, that shul, which served the Jewish community there in Gaza City, was destroyed by the ruler of Egypt, who then becomes the ruler of Eretz Yisrael, who's the son of Muhammad Ali, and his name is Ibrahim Pasha.
Actually, it's a fascinating part of Jewish presence in Eretz Yisrael, because if you take the last 500 years of Jewish history, so Eretz Yisrael is ruled by the Ottoman Empire, which it sits in Turkey, in Istanbul, and there was a window, a very, very short window of another governing body on Eretz Yisrael during those 500 years, and that is the Tkufa of Ibrahim Pasha. Now, you're saying that he destroyed the shul in Gaza, right? But you have to mention in the same breath that Ibrahim Pasha was very kind to the Jews of Tzfas and the Galil, and he actually helped a very influential Jew by the name of Yisrael Beck, if you know the name, and he's the one who eventually came to Yerushalayim and built the shul that, again, is under controversy now, the Tiferes Yisrael shul in the Old City. If you're reading the news, you know there's a whole machlokes about it, who's going to run the shul.
But historic shul, which was the base of the Hasidim in the Old City.
Right.
Over the square, opposite from the Churva.
Right.
A huge dome building like the Churva, but it was the Hasidim, not the Litvaks.
Right. There was different reasons why the Rishon wanted to build that shul. Some say it was to make a presence of Kedusha against the presence of the tumor from the Russian church. Some say he wanted to make like you said, a major Hasidic shul in the Old City, in contrast to the Churva shul, which was the Litvish shul. But in any case, the person who built that shul was Rabbi Yisrael Beck. Rabbi Yisrael Beck came originally from Tzfas. He was originally from Barditchev. He had a printing press. He came to Tzfas, opened up a printing press in Tzfas, and he had a very good relationship with Ibrahim Pasha. And he allowed him to establish the first agricultural Jewish settlement in Eretz Yisrael, way before the secular Zionists came, which was on the Jelmak. If you know, the Jelmak is Har Meron. There was a yeshuv that's today called Chubat Bek. It's in Arabic. It's the churvis of Bek's. Right. And when Moshe Montefiore came to visit Eretz Yisrael, he was so impressed with what he saw, the magnificent yeshuv that Beck made on the Jelmak, that he had this grand plan to work together with Ibrahim Pasha and buy off land in the Galil and Tzfas and bring thousands of Jews from Europe. Right. That would have been like the beginning of the Jewish state.
Shivas Tzion long before.
Right. According to Montefiore. It all fell apart. It all fell apart because Ibrahim Pasha's rule did not last a long time. Okay, the Ottomans with the
reasserted control.
Together with the French and the British, they reinstituted their shlita on Eretz Yisrael.
So while he was an Egyptian ruler, his father was a Muhammad Ali of Egypt, not the boxer, for those who know that particular slice of sporting history. And while he controls Eretz Yisrael, he dismantles this shul. He controls Gaza, which is part of the Holy Land, and he dismantles this shul, and the place eventually becomes a Catholic church. So I'm just putting two and two together in my hurried, slightly slapdash journalistic fashion over here, saying we know there's a shul, we know the Catholic Church was built on its site. Maybe it's that it's just there in the news, and that's merely a hook, though, to go back and Rabbi Galinsky to discuss this whole Jewish presence, which we know if we go only 20 years ago, there was now today, and now in the summer. This is when I first arrived in Eretz Yisrael for a visit, and I saw the terrible sights. I remember that, the Orange movement. You see thousands of youth and older people there in the orange T-shirts and all this stuff, protesting the imminent destruction of the Gaza Strip's Jewish communities. And we're going to be touching on a few things in this episode, which is some of the halachic aspects of the Jewish presence in the Gevulos Eretz, the borders of Eretz Yisrael. What is the halachic status of Gaza? But cycling back to almost present times, with the destruction of those communities. And particularly, I'd just like to give a head up to readers that I'm going to be quoting over here from some notes I've taken in a forthcoming book on the life of Simcha Cohen Cook, who I've based in Rehovot, who had a lot to do with these communities there for many years, and was there right as the curtain went down on them. Okay, so where do we begin here? Let's cycle back as far as we can in this story over here.
First of all, even someone who's not such a big bucky in Jewish history will know that there was a Jewish presence in Gaza at least more than 400 years ago. How would he know? That's a riddle for you. Very simple raya that there was a Jewish presence in Gaza in the 1600s.
You could mean one of two things. No, I think you mean only one thing. You mean in the time of Shabtai Tzvi.
Exactly.
Go on.
Shabtai Tzvi's Novi, quote unquote, the one who proclaimed him being Mashiach, was Natan Ha'azati.
Nathan of Gaza.
Right.
It has a ring to it. It had a ring to it back then. Many people. So who was?
He was there in the 1660. I think that was the kufa that he was there, and before his time, a drop before like 50 years, or even less than that, the Rav of Gaza was the famous Mechaber of the Piyut Koribon, which is probably, I once searched into this, I think it is the most composed Piyut on Shabbos in all time. Koribon.
And you know why,
I think there are like over 700 from all the Kilas.
Unbelievable. Well, firstly, it's because it's Ashkenazim and Sephardim sing it. But I think it's, to my mind, I've heard it sung, Rav Yaakov Hillel, Shlita, should be well, he's very ill now. Rav Yaakov Hillel sings it. It's like his national anthem. His anthem. He just sings it all the time because it's got nothing to do with Shabbos. It's talking about Oivad Gvurtech V'Simcha, the kind of this. It's this most beautiful poetic look at the world.
And it ends up the last two parts about Beis Hamikdash, which is
right. Lemikdash Tuv, etc. So if we're on the subject of Rabbi Yisrael Najara, and so that was composed in Tzfas. And we know it was composed in Tzfas, and we'll in a minute have this connected to Gaza. We know it's composed in Tzfas because over that song, or in general, Rabbi Yisrael apparently had a very nice voice, but anyway, he composed these lofty, soaring nigunim, of which most famous is Korban.
Not nigunim, piyutim.
Piyutim. Okay, so
the nigunim came later.
Okay, correct. So in the Sefer Pelei Yoetz, right, which is the classic Musa Sefos, it has, if you look under, I don't remember where I found it once, but either under the reference of Su'uda or under Shira. I think it's under Su'uda. So he has he writes there, this is...
Blazer Papo.
That's right, Blazer Papo, writes about an interaction that happened. He said once, Rabbi Yisrael Najara was sitting there singing one of his piyutim on Shabbos, the Shabbos Suda, and the Arizal's walking past outside, and he sees Malachim coming there to crowd around. Fascinating, right? To crowd around Rabbi Yisrael Najara's Shabbos Tish. And then he sees suddenly, now Rabbi Yisrael does not know he's just singing, but the Arizal sees it through the windows, and he sees suddenly at one point, Rabbi Yisrael Najara rolls up his sleeve, right? Rolls up his sleeve, and I don't know, maybe it's hot, the air conditioning wasn't working, and the malachim go. So the Arizal comes inside and tells him, you had malachim sitting here while you were singing, and they've gone. So he says, how can I bring them back? He says, cover yourself properly for the Suda. In other words, sit there like respectfully. Wow. Yes, he's there. Paley, and the malachim will come back, and indeed he carries on singing. So I mean, there's many things from there. Obviously, the Arizal was on such a lofty madrega that he was able to see this. But clearly, what does that say about Yisron Ajara? These weren't just piyutim, holy poet. This was such a lofty individual. And although that song, we know, thereby must have been right to have happened with the Arizal, that must have happened in Tzfas, the last 5 years of his life, from about 1620 to 1625, Rav Yisron Najara was the Rav of Gaza, and his son after Rav Moshe Najara. I think Najara is a place in Spain, by the way, something like that, but they come from there. So that is, and as you say, that is the golden age in the modern era of the Gazan Jewish community, because you have a substantial community that unusually, Rabbi Ephraim, does not need to schnorrer. This is very important. Whilst Yerushalayim and Hebron, which is the centers of Jewish civilization then in Eretz Yisrael, exist on the Chalukah, which is the money raised in Europe or probably across the Ottoman Empire actually, and supporting the communities in Yerushalayim and Hebron. In terms of history, it seems that the Gaza Jewish community was a prosperous one and did not need to be supported.
That is true. The Yerushalayim community was always poor. Yeah. That is true.
Yeah. And so what happens over here, there is ancient history, in Jewish history in Gaza, but we have this return in the 17th century and then it goes downhill. You have the rise at the peak under Yisron Ajara. It goes downhill because of the whole schism over the Shabtai Tzvi, and so the community rebuilds again. We have the Chida turns up there, spends a Shabbos there, and so he's.
So let's point out the Chida is we're talking about Yisron Ajara. Lahavdil after Avdol is Natan Azati was a drop later. Then you have the Chida, which is again later on.
Correct. Correct. I'm going
1700s later.
Correct. So in the 18th century, in other words, the Chida is going through. But again, this community, just skipping through very quickly, this community has problems under Napoleon. When Napoleon invades the Holy Land, then in 1799, I think it was, the community needs to pack out, and that's it. And they come back again in the...
It's a reoccurring theme in the Gaza community.
Gaza. It was a tenuous existence. In other words, it was always a peripheral community. They come back, and in 1831, their shul is destroyed, but they're still there. Eventually, in Tarpat, 1929, the anti-Jewish riots that destroy the Hebron Jewish community, they're exiled then again, and they come back after the 6-Day War, and which is kind of where we know this whole community, and then obviously in 2005, destroyed once again.
Right. I have like it's not a childhood memory, but right after I was married, we're talking about in 1992. So my shver took us, he took us as a young couple with their family to like a honeymoon type of thing to the beautiful hotel called Malon Nevet Kalim. Were you ever there?
I was never in Gush Katif at all.
Right, it was beautiful. It was on the shores of Gaza, and beautiful place. And who was sitting next to us? Right next to us on the table in the hotel.
Go on.
Right next to us.
You'll never guess.
Agon Reb Shmuel Auerbach.
Wow.
Sitting at the table. And it's interesting.
So people used to go there?
People used to go there. And what was he doing? The whole day he was just sitting on a porch, like opposite sitting learning opposite the waves.
It's like Galinsky. That's the equivalent. Sitting on the roof of Galinsky in Netanya, right. Or it's either the roof of Galinsky in Netanya, or it's in the Veda Kalim in what was then Gush Katif, right. Very sadly destroyed. So let's go back. We've kind of talked about the kind of 16th century to the 20th century, and in fact into the 21st century. We're going to cycle into the 21st century a bit later, but let's go all the way back and understand for a minute, Rabbi Galinsky, what is the status of Gaza in halacha?
Right. Actually, this shaila is a very complicated shaila, which does not have a clear resolution. Okay, till this day. And the big problem stems from a stira between the Maharit and the Ridbaz, which lived at the time of Beis Yosef, after the Beis Yosef, about what was the minig in Yerushalayim regarding using fruit from Gaza. On the one hand, the Maharit says all the food in Yerushalayim was transported from Gaza, and we used to eat it without any Gedusha, nothing.
Marit being Rabbi Yeshaya of Trani?
Right, he was the son of the Mabit, who was the contemporary of the Beis Yosef on his Bezdin in Sfaz, and Marit was after him. Those who learn Hilchas Shmita, the name of the Marit comes up a lot because the Chazon Ish adapts a certain shita of the Marit, and I think the Chazon Ish points out the Marit was the Gdoila Achronim, like he puts him on top of everyone. So we have a tshuva on the one hand saying that the peiros coming from Gaza to Yerushalayim were, the minig was to eat them without any restrictions.
Meaning Shemitah didn't apply?
Nothing.
So it's considered to be outside the borders of Eretz
that's
Yisrael.
That's
that would imply that, right?
And in Tzad Sheni, we have the testimony of the Ridbaz, who is also a Rav in Yerushalayim, and he doesn't mention anything like that. So there's a problem over here. It's very difficult to be miyashev this theory in the minig of Yerushalayim. But getting back to the basics, right? The basics of Gvulos Haaretz. When you're talking about Gvulos Haaretz, you have to break it up into at least 3 parts, okay? There's one part that has to do with what we call in modern Hebrew or the English, the promised land, or Haaretz HaMuftachat, right? What are we talking about? We're talking about what HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised to Avraham Avinu, okay? And that is, Nachal Mitzrayim ad Nahar Pros.
Go to the Euphrates, half of Turkey, Lebanon. It's going to be much bigger than it is now.
Much bigger. It's like probably 2 or 3 times than what we have today. And that, by the way, I don't think that has halachic significance.
It's only when they come to Eretz Yisrael.
Right. Okay, so now we're going to other 2 parts, and that is Oile Mitzrayim and Oile Bavel.
Which translates as those who...
Oile Mitzrayim is those parts of the promised land that were captured by those who came from Mitzrayim, meaning Yoshua Benun. Okay? That is called in the Lashon of the Gemara, Halacha, Gedusha Rishayna.
Okay? The first sanctification of Eretz Yisrael took place when they first conquered it under Yeshua.
Now, the halacha is that Gedusha Rishayna batla.
Okay? That's it. It went. Once they were exiled.
Usually the reason that they give is for Kedusha Rishayna was done by the Aron, and it was done by Yeshua and the Aron, and since that was finished, it was captured afterwards. It doesn't have any significance to today. But the Kedusha Shnia, which is Oile Bavel, which is Ezra and onward,
when they returned from the Babylonian exile, so therefore they sanctified it again, and that never leaves.
Right, they never sanctified it by kibush, which was there. They just lived there.
Right.
Okay, and that never went away.
So anywhere that the returning exiles lived,
right, that has halachic significance.
And that's smaller because that area of the difference between, if you say the first was the promised land was enormous. Right. But in reality, only sanctified the first time on a certain area of it. And the second time round sanctified even less. Right.
And that's why you have this very interesting halacha called Beit Shan, if you know what I'm talking about. Yep. It's like a muvlat. You have an enclave inside Eretz Yisrael, which does not have the halachas of. It was purposely left not. I think it's brought out in Chazal. It's that the aniyim should have a place to be misparnes from. So in any case, we're talking about. And Oile Bavel, which the majority of the halachic significance comes from Oile Bavel. However, there is a certain halachic significance from Oile Mitzrayim, and that is that there's a certain Gedusha to Eretz Yisrael. And here we have a very interesting question. A lot of people don't know this, and some people are shocked when I talk to them about it, is that there's actually a halacha that you're not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. Did you ever hear of this halacha, Gedalia?
I've heard occasionally. Every time I go through the airport.
Many people, by the way, we once interviewed for the Kulmus, for the Hebrew Kulmus, and he told us when he came to visit Eretz Yisrael, so he went to visit the Briskerov son, Rebel. They brought money from Chutz La'aretz, for donations to the yeshiva.
Rav Yoshe Soloveitchik of YU used to send money.
I don't know if it came from Rav Yoshe. They brought money.
He used to.
I know that he used to send, but I don't know if he sent it through Rav Hershel Shechter. But when he came in to visit Rebel, Briskerov's son, so Rebel told him, "You know that you are now a prisoner." He says, "What do you mean?" He says, "You're not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. You're stuck."
He made it out.
Apparently, he didn't paskin like a rebel, but that's what a rebel held. They're not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. Now, this nekuda of leaving Eretz Yisrael is dependent on Oile Mitzrayim. That's how some people say. I mean, there's a certain kedusha to those parts that were captured by Oile Mitzrayim and not by Oile Bavel, that the issue of leaving, it wouldn't apply to that because there's a certain kedusha to it.
So where does the Gaza Strip come into this?
So now we're coming to the Gaza Strip. Now, that is the question. Remember we mentioned in the beginning about the Marit and the Ridbaz. So that is the question. What was the status of Gaza? Was it captured by Ole Mitzrayim and not by Ole Bavel? Wasn't it captured at all, even by Ole Mitzrayim? Like, and some people say that's the shita of the Rambam, that there's nothing there. It's only part of the Aretz HaMuftachat, the promised land.
Right, because again, it's clear that promised land goes all the way possibly to the Nile, and certainly it goes to the El Arish, right, which is the Sinai. So the Gaza Strip is definitely inside the land that's promised to Avram Avinu.
Right.
But the question is, was it
Tluyas
sanctified?
Right. Mitzvahs Tluyas Ba'aretz, that is the big question. And it seems very clear that many of the Rishonim hold that it was not captured by Ole Bavel. Right, but I'm sure there are shittas who say that it was captured by Ole Bavel, because there are shittas who say that you have to keep, like the Ritbaz says, that you have to keep doing some Isis and Shvius on those places. So that is the problem of Gaza. But what we do know is that until the time of the Hashmonaim, Hasmonean period, like they say in history books, there was no Jewish presence in Gaza. Right, whatever we spoke about till now was much later than that. The Ottoman Empire is let's say 1,500 years after the Hashmonaim, right? Yes, it's 1,500 years afterwards. So anything that started was from the period of the Hashmonaim. Before that, we don't have. You mentioned to me, like an off-the-record discussion that we had, that some people want to say that Nachal Gror which
runs into Gaza,
right, is
from the Negev,
right. So that would make the Ovis already in that area. But we don't have as Gaza. We don't have any record of a Jewish presence in Gaza from that Kufa. So it makes a lot of sense that it was not captured by Ole Bavel. Okay, so just to summarize the halachic opinion, so it's clear from the Ma'arit that Ole Bavel did not conquer Gaza, and that is why the Ma'arit says the mini Yerushalayim was that there were no mitzvahs tluyas ba'aretz on the payers coming from Gaza, and the shittas Agoyin is that it was conquered by Ole Bavel, and that's why all the halachas apply. So that's where we're holding today.
Let's cycle forward into post-Six Day War, right? Post-Six Day War, you have the state of Israel, triples in size. You had the Golan Heights and the whole of Yehuda and Shomron, and they had
Sinai,
which was, forget the Gaza Strip, it was all the way to what the Israeli soldiers would call it Africa. When they went across is strange to think, but the Suez Canal, sets apart the Sinai Peninsula is part of one continent. Across is Asia. Is effectively Eurasia over here. And if you cross the Suez Canal, you're in Africa. And the Israelis used to talk in the Yom Kippur War, we're going across to Africa now, right? But very much in that case, that historic Gaza with all its links, Jews had lived there until fairly recently. And in fact, we had a man over here who used to be the head of Shai, if you remember him. He used to be the head of, in Mishpacha, the head of marketing. And he was telling me he did his service in Gaza and his, as in the military service in Gaza. His grandfather had grown up in Gaza. And he said, and his grandfather said to him the first day, he said when he went in there, check if the Makolit is still there on the corner of Salah al-Adin, the main north-south road that goes through Gaza. See if it's still there. And he went, and yes, there it was. It was still there, and until the 50s, the shul in Gaza City, the Gaza City has a neighborhood called Shejaya, where it's and the shul was there. And it had the Beis HaKvaros, and this was the Beis HaKvaros where Yisrael of Najjar was buried, and it was destroyed. Now, what happened was in 1948, obviously the State of Israel, there was the War of Independence. The Egyptians were ruling the area. Israel didn't manage to free it, and in fact, there were massive battles in the Negev, not far away. And 1956, the Suez Campaign, when Israel attacked Egypt together with Britain and France, etc., Israel conquered the area. was able to take it over briefly until all of them, Britain, France, and Israel, forced out of the area under the United States pressure.
That was important for them because of trade, right? Because of
The
trade
Suez Canal. They wanted the Suez Canal, which had been built, and controlled by the British and French. So they wanted in again, and they were forced out in a humiliating retreat by the United States, which was famously, that was the end of the British Empire. That was the final death knell for the British Empire. The humiliating failure. But Israel had been successful. They conquered the Gaza Strip. They were forced out, and when the Egyptians came back, what they did was they wanted to de-Judaize the whole thing. So what they did was they bulldozed the old Beis HaChaim there, the Beis HaKvaros, 1956. So when in 1967, 11 years later, the Israelis come back in the Six-Day War triumphant, and in fact they roll in, take Gaza, and they take all the way up to the Suez Canal, there's no signs of any Jewish presence left there. But it took a while, and there was, as part of the push to settle these huge new lands, so the government built settlements inside Gush Katif, what became Gush Katif, and obviously they built it right into the Sinai as well. People maybe are not aware, not everyone's aware, but there was a big Jewish town called Yamit. The evacuation, I think, in 1979 of Yamit, it was a precursor and a promo to this very tragic evacuations, what eventually came as a result of the Oslo peace process and the destruction of the Gaza Jewish communities there in 2005. So in Gaza, it was settled, what became known as Gush Katif. There was, I think, basically in between 1.5 million Arabs, there was these Jewish communities were placed there. And they were from the beginning even in terms of the settlements, if you like to call them that, they were very dangerous places to live. There was bombings and there were shootings because they were so strategically placed to divide up Gaza, north to south. We had some in the northern Gaza Strip. You had some in the center, I think, what's called the Netzarim corridor. Anyone who's following the news now knows it's the Netzarim corridor. That basically a road that goes from the Israeli border all the way to Mediterranean, a few miles across, and it goes through the road that used to run through Netzarim, the Jewish community of Netzarim, and it bisects Gaza. It splits it into two. In the news, they talk about the Morag axis as well, which is further down. Morag is down towards the southern Gaza Strip, and it's also these roads they use. The roads follow the old roads that were placed by the army there to the settlements that were Jewish villages there that were placed there strategically to break up the contiguity and prevent the Palestinians having just control of the whole Gaza Strip. In any case, we had this Gush Katif there down at the bottom. And I think it's Rabbi Galinsky, it's such to people, if you're coming on the scene, you're just kind of waking up to this, you say, yes, 20 years since Gush Katif. But if you live through this and you perhaps wouldn't understand how traumatic it was this was a terrible Jewish disaster, a churban.
You had families who lived there their whole lives. I mean, you had kids who were born there and grew up there and got married and lived there. And this whole thing was just uprooted because of, I'm sorry to say this, a mishagas of one person. It's really mind-boggling because today you would think that in order to reach such a decision, you would have to go through many committees and votes and all that. And because of his power, because of his personality, he was called the bulldozer, right? Yeah, he managed to bulldoze through this whole thing. It made no sense. No one thought of it.
Well, hold on. I think back in the context, I think we have to understand one thing. It was very dangerous. These communities were constantly being rocketed and mortared. And the theory then, even back then, there were large parts of the right that said, this is terribly naive. With the idea that the world is suddenly going to come onto our side and believe us and support us if we get any more rockets coming from there, if you pull out these and destroy these Jewish communities, is nonsense, right? But the reason it worked at the time was because of the exhaustion with 20 years of Palestinian terror. Now, in retrospect, and this wasn't just not just in hindsight, but for many of the people there and for many in the wider society, it was like a car crash in slow motion that you could see happening. They could see, as soon as if you give the Palestinians control over their own land and not have the army patrol and, root out the pockets of terror, it's going to be the rockets on Israel proper. It's going to be on Sderot, and it's going to be in Ashkelon, and it's going to be in Ashdod, and it's going to be on Tel Aviv and Yerushalayim. And that's exactly what happened. And what a terrible tragedy to see within a relatively short space of time. And that's why it sounds like naive and tragic at the same time. But it's
like, what were you thinking?
Correct.
Right?
But it's all the more, Rabbi Ephraim, it's all the more tragic. And this is because when you know, there was almost, as you experienced it, but it was almost like a Gan Eden there inside these places. In the sense that also there were Chasheva Jewish communities there of Shomer Torah and mitzvahs who, because they were so...
It was, by the way, it was a stronghold of Chardalnikim, which, if you know, I don't know if all the listeners know what that means, right?
It's not mustard.
Today, if even officially, right, when they make surveys in the national religious world in Eretz, they break it up into 3 parts, okay? And we say that in Hebrew, right? In Hebrew, it's Chardal, and it's mainstream, a Hebrew word, right? Mainstream. And haliberalim, right?
So we talk about the Chardal, it means the Haredi Leumi. It means on the national religious Zionist spectrum. These are the intensely, more Haredi standard oriented.
These are Talmidim and Talmidim of Rav Tzvi the Cook. This is where it comes from. Right. All of them. There's no other personality that led them. This is entirely the working of him, which is Rav Kook, the first Rav Kook's only son.
And if you mention Rav Kook, and this is something that is very interesting to know, one of the major Haredi figures who was involved in the struggle to prevent the destruction of Gush Katif was Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook's cousin, who was the Simcha Cohen Kook, based in the Rehovot, and the Rav of the Churva in the Old City, Churva Shul in the Old City. He adopted the communities, and he had a very unique relationship with the communities in Gush Katif, and he was in some ways like a posek for them. He used to visit the schools, the Talmud Torah over there, and he used to say about them that something very special. He used to say that here in Gush Katif, they don't just grow bug-free lettuce, so they grow bug-free children as well.
You'll have to explain that statement, because in Eretz Yisrael today, the bug-free lettuce is still called in the stores
Gush Katif. Because they pioneered in Gush Katif, the agricultural industry there was extremely advanced, and they pioneered the whole development of growing literally bug-free vegetables. And
it's actually fascinating because these Chardali communities, they had visits from real Gedalia Poiskim, the Haredi Gedalia Poiskim, used to come down there and visit them, and a lot of tshuvas about their produce. Right. They made the breakthrough in the
correct. So he said about them, it was not just the bug-free lettuce, also the bug-free children. And he said because of a certain purity, those in terms of they were the creme de la creme, the most idealistic of all of the settlement movement was to live there because of its historic significance, but because of its isolation, it required the most mysterious nefesh, and they had to go to. It was dangerous. I spoke to a couple of the principals of the Talmud Torah there, and I think one in Atzmona and one in, if I'm not mistaken. And these are names that are back from 20 plus years ago, 25 years ago now, and they say they had to open a local Talmud Torah because there were explosive devices, bombs that they underneath the buses, a tragic massacre and they destroyed. And then even when they made armored buses, armored from underneath, it was too dangerous to send because the school gives you some idea of what it was like over there. That we shouldn't look back and say, oh, why did they take them out of there? That was the context as well.
As you said, you're right. There was a problem.
The solution was more destructive than the problem itself, no question, in retrospect.
The more scarier part is that they said that Sharon agreed to it because he was threatened by lawsuits about different financial things. Right?
That entered Israeli political parlance because you have a term over here, la'atreg, to treat someone like an esrog. That came from one of the major columnists at the time. He said once Sharon had decided to implement the policy of the left wing in terms of
disengagement.
It was just euphemism. It was not disengagement. It was what's called that many people call the Girush Gush Katif, the expulsion. Once he decided to implement the left wing's policy and to implement Oslo, in effect, he was treated. Suddenly, magically, the judicial authorities stopped investigating corruption, and they treat him like an esrog. And that is what a terrific level of corruption, which led to destruction of Jewish communities and arguably to the tragedies of October the 7th.
I want to put it in something very interesting. At that kufa, mamish, at that kufa, when Arion Sharon pushed through the Gush Katif, I was on a trip that the community organized for parents and children, like to some place in the Tzafon, in the north, like it was Dafka in the Jermak, like near Har Meron, beautiful place. And on the bus, prizes on the bus was today, someone who's known as one of the big poskim today in the literature world in Eretz Yisrael. Yeah. And he was there with his teenage kids. And it so happened that he was sitting right in front of me on the bus. And we started schmoozing. And we started schmoozing about Ariel Sharon. And he told us, don't you see how you can't rely on someone who has a right-wing ideology, but he's not frum? It doesn't hold water. You don't know when it's going to...
Because Sharon was the most right-wing of the right wing.
He
was the one who put all these communities there.
Right.
He put them there, and that was why the utter sense of betrayal afterwards. But I'm going back to Rav Simcha Kook. He went there, and he would, when these communities were under attack, he went to visit them, which was very rare, a figure in the Haredi world to do that. And he came there, and he would speak in the schools and the different shuls, go around for a day at a time. And one of these principals told me of the Talmud Torah over there, said that he remembers what he said. He came along and he said, and on the wall there was a chart, and 2 lines, a graph, etc. And there was 2 lines with numbers on them. And he asked, "What's this?" He says, "This is the number of." They said, "This is the number of missiles and mortars on one side, and the other side, the other axis was the other bar was the number of mishnayos." So isn't that beautiful? And he told them he was moved to tears by it. And he said, "Always make sure the number of mishnayos stays ahead of the number of missiles, because that's going to protect you." But that's what he meant, that there was communities of Yerei Shamayim which you didn't find elsewhere. When cycling ahead, when Ariel Sharon announced this political plan which became the disengagement or the expulsion of Gush Katif, Rav Simcha Kook, among others, fought this massively. And what he tried to do was he tried to get the weight of the Haredi world into it, and he realized that the address here is Rav Elyashiv.
I have to point out that Rav Simcha Kook was like a Talmud of some sorts of Rav Elyashiv.
Very close to him.
He was like his man in the Rabbanut.
Correct. And
we see that at the end. They rebuilt the Chur Shul, and Rav Elyashiv was very concerned about what type of...
So it shouldn't turn into a museum and events hall, etc.
He actually compelled Rav Simcha Kook to become the Rav of the place, because he understood that he's the only figure that's going to garner support from everyone, and that's it. And he agreed. He took it upon himself.
Correct, which is what he's associated with in many people's minds, not Rehovot, the way he was for 50 years, but the last 10 years of his life when it's in the Churva Shul. But anyway, he took leading security experts to Rav Elyashiv, and Rav Elyashiv would sit there on the maps. He saw the maps of Eretz Yisrael, on the military maps, and he said, and in the end, he was able to, and Rav Elyashiv came out and said, "That's it, we cannot support this thing." Although we have to remember, again, it's only in retrospect we forget how great a consensus at the time it became. Even the Likud, Bibi Netanyahu supported this, right? It was seen as being something that, yes, it was a way, if we get out this bloodbath, this quagmire in Gush Katif, we could have reset with the Palestinians. It was the last flicker of the madness from the Oslo Peace Accords. And what happened was that and many people did not see it the way that Rav Simcha Kook saw it. His son told me he went around for a year distraught, totally distraught. And his nephew, somebody was a yeshiva bacher at the time, he would say to yeshiva bacherim, he would say to anyone, "Are you not bothered by this? Are you not bothered by this?" And they would say, "Well, there's nothing I can do." He said, "But at least you can cry. Can you not?" He said like this, "Let's say," he said, "it's justified. Let's say it's got to be done. But you're losing part of Eretz Yisrael, which is a holy place." And he said, imagine the following thing. A doctor said, your leg has got gangrene and needs to be amputated. It needs to be done. A person gets their leg amputated. Are they happy? Well, they're relieved that their life has been saved, but they've lost a leg. They've lost a limb. And that is how he said, we've lost a limb of Eretz Yisrael. That was his tremendous Avos Eretz Yisrael. It was a legendary figure in that respect.
In order for people to appreciate it, you have to give at least a few words who Rav Simcha Kook was. Because when you're telling someone he was the nephew of Rabbi Moshe Grylak, so it gives the impression that you're talking about someone who grew up in the Dati Leumi world. So you have to give us some kind of a introduction. And I know you're the big mumcha on Rav Simcha Kook. So just for 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Who was Rav Simcha Kook?
Rav Simcha Kook was a creation of a son of his father, right? His father, Rav Rafal Cohen Kook, was a nephew of the Rav Kook, the Raya Kook, Rabbi Yitzchak Cohen Kook, but at the same time was a Talmud Muvak. At the same time as being a Talmud of his uncle, he was a Talmud Muvak of the Brisker Rav.
His father was a nephew to the first Rav Kook and a Talmud of the Brisker Rav.
Correct. So Rav Simcha Kook was brought up in this house in which there was access to this unusually broad range of Gedalia Yisrael. He went on to become the chief rabbi of Rehovot afterwards, and towards the end of his life,
I think he learned in the Chevron Yeshiva.
He was a Chevron Talmud, also a Talmud of Slobodka, and he was a bridge-building figure.
He actually became the Rav of Rehovot only after his older brother was tragically killed in a car crash.
In a crash with a train ran tragically over the shore. His older brother, Shlomo Zalman Kook, Shlomo Kook was the chief rabbi of Rehovot, a very brilliant and Eloi and a charismatic person. The Rav Simcha himself was a person of tremendous charisma, tremendous force of nature, but he was recognized as being this. He created a revolution in his town of Rehovot because he was able to take a city that was actually very, in a sense, very liberal. It's a university town that was open on Shabbos, for example, and he went against the national trend. He was able to close it on Shabbos, and that was because he had such an amazing way of representing the Torah in the public square. And so he had these links. He was a thoroughly Haredi figure. He is all his kids learned in Ponovitch Yeshiva, right? He was, one of his biggest things was founding in Rehovot of major Litvish Yeshiva, which he found, which
Mora
is
Talmud.
Mora Talmud.
It functions still today, hundreds of Bachrim, very chashuv Yeshiva. It's run by his brother,
who is called Rabbi Yitzchak Cohen Kook.
Right.
So, and in their family, this is a family, the dynasty that's been going
on. By the way,
200
he's the
years.
member of the Litvische Haredi Moetzes Gedalia Torah.
Correct. So when you have a figure like Simcha Kook showing up in Gush Katif, and that was because he was a man of Klal Yisrael. He was above. He was just Torah, and wherever it could be taught, and wherever he could have an impact, he showed up. And this was a unique individual. So
you must point out that there were other Haredi figures who lent their support to Gush Katif, like I think Stolner Rebbe,
Boston Rebbe as well.
Rebbe, right? Those are at least two names that come to mind.
Correct. So when the struggle of Gush Katif, he wasn't in it just on his own, but he was the one who was able to mobilize parts of the Haredi world against it. He's going to say because it's a disaster in terms of security, and the Kedusha, less of Eretz Yisrael there. Just to fast forward though to what happens over here, there's something unique that people aren't aware of, because when the Gush Katif it was clear in the last months of the Gush Katif's existence, before these 10,000, the good people, Jews, had been ripped out of their houses, their shuls destroyed, he would go there often. But he said he told them, and there were many people at the time who were saying, no, we live with Emunah, Hashem's going to protect us. And there were even, I remember at the time, do you remember there was these people who were busy, on the day that the communities were destroyed, were busy pouring concrete for more buildings. I remember that at the time. And it's beautiful, but also some of the people lived there with a blind faith that it was going to get better. And Rav Simcha did not say that. He said to them, early, he said, this government has, and he recognized Sharon's determination to make it happen. It's not going to work. He said, let's make plans to move. Why? If you take these tremendous centers of Torah which have been created, communities that were really on a very high level of Torah, some of them, if you take those and plant them strategically, move as a community back into mainland Eretz Yisrael, as it were, you can change this place. And he was so distraught, not only by the destruction of the communities per se, but also because of what it meant that they'd been scattered all over and the effect had been lost. Fast forward to something which I think is not very well known, because the last flicker or the last signs of Jewish life in Gush Katif or the Gaza Strip in modern times is not now, because the army's there, but it's pretty clear they're not going to be putting back. They'll maybe have some bases there, or sometimes just in, they're negotiating with these terrible Hamas to perhaps to leave on the periphery some Israeli presence. But it's pretty clear at this stage there's not going to be any Jewish communities there for the foreseeable future. The last signs of the community there were not, in fact, the people themselves or their houses. It was the Shuls. And this is an episode which is both beautiful and tragic. The battle over the Shuls.
First of all, it was a very serious halachic shaila before it became a court shaila, which you'll be talking about, it was a halachic shaila, because what do you do to a shul that might be defiled by goyim?
Correct. And Rabbi Ephraim, this was a shaila that was brought up by Rav Simcha Kook. What had happened was that when the government passed the law that became the Gush Katif law, it had it's a law with language, legal terms in it, and it said like this: the homes of the residents and sensitive buildings, including Batei Knesset, won't remain. That was the initial protocol of what became disengagement law.
Meaning that the government itself wanted to actively dismantle.
So this is what it is. When a few weeks before, literally as I think it was a Tisha B'Av, right? I mean, it's a terrible thought to think. It was obvious at the time. The Puronos that comes during the 3 weeks, it was a remarkable timing. The Puronos was the most serious destruction of Jewish life in Eretz Yisrael since the Churban happened during the 3 weeks on Tisha B'Av. I mean, the timing was so awesome in the real sense.
It was done by Jewish government.
And to think it was done by Jewish government. But so when they came last minute to the government, they said, hey, what about the shuls? And they said, we've been talking about this law for a whole year. It's been written. So Simcha Kook was able to go and say to them, you said the homes of the residents and sensitive buildings, including Batei Knesset, won't remain. But it did not say you're going to be destroyed, because they did do a feasibility study about an engineering study about removing the shuls in their entirety. That was what people thought at the beginning. And in fact, they were able to say and argue in front of Israel's High Court that they only woken up to this possibility later, because that's what they thought. And they studied it and they said, no, it can't be done. It wasn't constructed in such a way you could just move it. To be fair, the Sharon government's decision that they're going to destroy the shuls, painful as it is, was based on the thought of what eventually actually happened. Those terrible sights of Palestinian mobs torching shuls, right? That's number one. Number two, I think a bit less nobly, they wanted to make sure that there was nothing left, because if the shuls left, you're going to have some of the original inhabitants and settlers trying constantly to go back and to visit them. And the government and Sharon wanted to make sure that was not the case. But
that's an interesting point. You know that as a fact that this was one of the
yes, I mean, this is not coming from me. This is coming from, there's a lawyer called Gilad Coronaldi, who was a lawyer who led the fight for this, and he wrote a book called Mishpacha, which is a moving title, and the Eli judgment and the closing judgment, as it were. And what happened was, it seems that the chief rabbinate had been asleep on this, and that the government had pushed this through with some type of nod, okay, by the chief rabbinate, who said, yeah, you could do it, you could destroy the shuls for etc. And it was, as Tisha B'Av approached, it was a group of Rabbanim, including Rav Simcha Kook, and it was Rav Shari Yashuv Cohen, I think, Chief Rabbi of Haifa.
Just a word who Rav Shari Yashuv Cohen was. He was the son of probably the only recent Nazir.
He was the son of the Nazir.
Right. He was the only son of the only Nazir that existed in the last few generations. Okay.
He was a Talmud. The Nazir was a Talmud of Rav Kook.
Rav Kook, right. The Nazir himself was like he wasn't a real Baal Tshuva. He was actually a Radhanet Talmud who was looking into secular studies in university in Europe, and he met up with Rav Kook, and he became a very close Talmud of Rav Kook, and he came to Eretz Yisrael, and at a certain point he became a Nazir, and if you look for pictures of him, Rab David HaKohen, you'll actually see a Nazir. It's fascinating. He was a very holy person. He lived in his whole life in Geula, in a Haredi. He lived in the same building as Reb David Soloveitchik, and they were very nice to each other. They had good relations. And his son, who also, at a certain point in his life, was a Nazir.
I didn't know that.
Yes. You can look for old pictures of him. He was a Nazir at a certain point, and I think he gave it up later on. I don't know how he did it. But he was later elected the chief rabbi of Haifa and was the chief rabbi of Haifa for many decades.
That's interesting. So that's Rav Shari Yashuv Cohen. They realized at the relatively last minute, this was going to happen. What's going to be with the shuls? It caused a massive uproar at the time. Natan Sharansky, who was a famous figure, put it as in the practical ramifications of how this was going to be seen around the world. He said, every time, imagine if we try and defend and prevent the destruction of a Jewish cemetery or an old unused Jewish shul, shul somewhere in Eastern Europe that the authorities want to seize and turn into a shopping center. What are we going to say? We're going to say that we don't destroy shuls, and then they'll say, well, the state of Israel destroys shuls and destroys big ones and it destroys many at a time. He says we're going to turn ourselves into a laughing stock. So you're saying there's a precedent here. And so there began a battle. It took place, a very intense battle that reached the High Court. The diggers and the heavy tractors were waiting to destroy the shuls. Gush Katif was already empty. The shuls were the only thing left. And I think it was Neve Kalim, if I'm not mistaken, this magnificent shul, Beis HaMedrash, which looked like a Mogen David, right? And this was, you see the pictures of it, it's tragic, it's empty. But it wasn't destroyed, and they were trying. Rav Simcha Kook went to Rav Eliashiv, and he showed him, and he was the one who got involved, and he said, can we stop? Is it right to destroy the shuls? And the Rav Eliashiv said, no, we're not going to destroy shuls. And he got a psak, and it was a very rare thing. It was written to a psak to him. It was, towards the end of Rav Eliashiv's life, the last few years, they came up with this psak. And he's testifying before the Knesset's Vadat Chukah, the Constitution Committee and Law Committee. He said he spoke about, the Simcha Kook spoke about what he'd seen in Gush Katif. He said, we cried bitterly to see the former Gan Eden turned into a churban, right? And he said, a lawyer asked me, where does it say in halacha that it's forbidden for a Jew to destroy a shul? He said to the Knesset, the committee there that was, debating this law. And he said, it's not written. Because from the days of the elders of Am Yisrael in the Midbar, from the time of the Nevi'im and the Tanoim, the Amoraim, from the time of the Gaonim, Rishonim, and Acharonim, until our day, never was this question asked, Jews to destroy their own shuls. He had this intervention. It could not be resolved. The government does not have to listen to the Constitution Committee. The bulldozer, Ariel Sharon, was going to bulldoze it all the way. He was determined. Once he made up his mind, he was determined at all. And it took the battle for the shuls of Gush Katif took place, final battle, in the High Court, which is the Bagatz, right? Israel's Supreme Court, the High Court as it's known. And I think it's important to understand, Rabbi Ephraim, it was a battle with no good outcome. Right? If you destroy the shuls, Jews have to set the precedent of destroying their own shuls. And if you don't, they'll be destroyed by them. So what happened was the case was being argued by this religious lawyer, Gilad Korinaldi. And he wrote in his book, he said, one of the most dramatic scenes ever witnessed was when the Rabbonim came and testified in the High Court. Now, he said this was extremely unusual because what happens is the way that the High Court operates over here is that only the lawyers speak, the lawyers and the judges speak. You don't hear from witnesses. But he asked, because of the extremely sensitive national question being asked over here, and a case with ramifications for the Jewish future and the Jewish history as well, and halacha, he said, can Rav Simcha Kook speak? And he said, and in this book, again, Mishpacha Eli, that this lawyer gave me, he says, describes this scene over here. He said, rising to his full height, Rav Simcha put his rabbinic Homburg hat in front of him, and he gave a speech, he says, that shook those present. He said, Am Yisrael has existed for 4,000 years. Never has a Jew raised his hand against his holy places. Muslims don't destroy mosques. Christians don't destroy churches. A Buddhist adherent won't destroy his shrine. Then he said, we kept our forces for months outside a church in Beis Lechem, right? Do you remember that? Actually, under Ariel Sharon a few years earlier, again, the Intifada, when they did the defensive shield, so as not to destroy a church. The Israelis kept siege because the Palestinian authorities, terrorists hold up inside.
Right.
And he said, we didn't do that so as not to destroy it. Okay, and we saw what happened last week when they bombed Gaza as well. Oy vavoy if you touch a church. And he carried on. When the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed by Titus, the Jewish people couldn't believe what they saw. None of us believed that Gush Katif would be destroyed. Maybe houses, but shuls? There is nothing like it in Jewish history. And he continued, we spoke to President Bush's advisors, to Palestinian leader Mohammed Ahlan, who protects shuls in Jericho and Jericho. In Gaza City, there were shuls that weren't destroyed. Interesting what he was talking about. Gaddafi's Libya, there were shuls that weren't destroyed. And in Tunis as well. In other words, he's saying, we can leave shuls under the Arabs, and maybe they're going to be he says churches aren't destroyed, mosques aren't destroyed, but shuls, yes. Are we to be the most degenerate of people? And as Corinaldi describes, the total silence there in the courtroom, total silence there. He said that he started breaking out in tears, or some chukuk, and it was utter silence there as he gave this address that was impressed everyone. He says, on the scales is the honor of the Jewish people. Non-Jews will say that they have never seen such a low people, one that destroys its own holy places. I turn to you in the name of Jews who go to shuls and batei medrash, and in the name of the Jewish people, have mercy on us. And that was the end of this. That was the end. And the Gilad Corinaldi says that from the tears shining in the eyes, he saw some of the judges crying. It was clear that his words, his passionate words, had come home. And the government lawyer wasn't able to do anything, and the decision was made. What they did was, they put, there's pictures there of, in the book, of the signs in blue, blue and white signs in Hebrew, in Arabic and English, saying that it's a holy place under international protection and that it should be left. And the decision was taken, as it were, that even if it was Jewish hands that amputated a limb of Eretz Yisrael, which was Gush Katif or Gaza, at least it wouldn't be Jewish bulldozers that destroyed, Gush Katif's shul. And for me, Rabbi Ephraim, that is the story of the most recent and the most tragic Churban, when a time now of Churban. And isn't it strange, and yet not strange at all, that this happened during the Bein HaMetzarim, and that the story of Gush Katif is one that rings from hundreds of years in the past and has continued till today. Thank you for listening to Behind the Times. We appreciate you joining us as we explore the stories and people that shape Jewish history. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with friends. Until next time.